Hello everyone, this is International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com, and today I'm going to be discussing a topic which has been a little bit ignored recently. This is the subject of endgame compositions, or endgame studies as they're also known. I think it's a little bit unfortunate that they've been ignored recently. These actually, I'm not talking about the type of problems where, for example, it's checkmate in 3 with an absurd position where one side has a lot of pieces and one side has only a king. I'm talking about positions that could reasonably occur in a real game, but just didn't, and they involve a very beautiful idea. That's the whole point, and I think that people should spend more time looking at these endgame studies, trying to solve them, and I think that will have a great improvement on your play. They also show you magical world that is not, you don't usually find in most chess positions. Out of the ordinary ideas, a pawn beating a queen, this type of thing. So to start off, I'm going to show you a study by T.B. Georgiev. I don't really know who this guy is, but he was a composer, and this was in a composing tournament of 1929. And this is kind of an interesting idea. First of all, we have this position that you see on the board. It's white to move, as most studies are white to move. White, of course, is down the exchange here, and his f-pawn is hanging, as is the knight. So I think it's pretty clear that in order to win, white's only chance is to promote the f-pawn. So with a little bit of thought, we find the idea of f5, followed by knight h6, and then f7. We see that it's very difficult for black to stop the pawn. So let's try it, f5. Now if the king takes the knight, play f takes g6 check, followed by king takes e4. And white naturally wins. So black needs to take on f5. And now we play knight h6 check. After king e6, for example, white plays f7, and there's no way to stop the pawn. So black needs to take the knight, and now f7. It seems like the game is over now. White is queening the pawn, but black has beautiful defense here. Knight g5 check, forcing white to take the knight, since the f-pawn is also under attack. King takes, and now if white queens the pawn, rook f6. And then it's a draw. But white has a good answer, h4. And now black can't take the pawn, because now rook f6 is no longer available. White simply queens and should win this position. So black plays, nice move, king g6. And now we find that if white queens the pawn, it's stalemate. But white has a better move. He makes it into a bishop. So in this is a strange situation where we need a bishop and not a queen. It doesn't happen very often, but on the other hand, we see some ideas that can be applicable to chess game with the trapped rook on h6, and these type of things show the possibilities of the pieces. And I've played some games against good players, and somehow it seemed like the game was looking like a study. I had an interesting game with Pavel Blatny where it looked like the game was a study for a long time. I could tell he'd spent some time with studies. And also I've heard from other information that in the Soviet camps, I mean the chess camp type, they're not just studying opening lines and learning some systems and things like that. They're also spending a lot of time, or they're also spending a lot of time solving studies. So this was the first one. And now I'll show you another one here. So this study was created by A.P. Gulayev and was published in Chess in the USSR in 1940. And this is kind of a unique looking position. But anyway, it also seems like white doesn't have huge chances to win. Black's threatening to push his f-pawn and queen, so it seems like bishop c5 is forced, but then black takes on g6, and I don't know, white's definitely not going to win. Black's going to take on h6 next. it's hard to say what's happening, but white has an interesting forced win here. Plays g7. Okay, that's also a possibility that comes to mind. And now black has only one legal move, f2. So now queening the pawn, or taking the rook and queening the pawn, white's losing, of course. Black queens the pawn, so he plays, nice idea, bishop to e7. Now black queens the pawn, has to. And now bishop f6. Strangely enough, thanks to the d3 pawn, black has no checks here. And meanwhile, white threatens checkmate in 1 by taking the rook, but black has a good answer. Queen takes f6. If white takes the queen, we have stalemate. Now, I don't particularly like studies that involve a lot of stalemates, because it's kind of unnatural. I like the ones that either involve a nice checkmate or that have some sort of positional draw, which is kind of unique, but occasionally it's reasonable, you know. So white can't take the queen, but instead white takes the rook. Now, of course, if king takes, white takes the queen and checkmate in the 2 moves. So black has to take the queen with his own queen, and now after d4, we have a unique position. White's down the queen for 2 pawns, of course, but black's in zugzwang, so he loses here. For example, queen g7 takes, h5, e6, h4, e7, h3, king d7, h2, and white queens with check. So this is a very beautiful final position with zugzwang when black's up a queen. Okay, so this was A.P. Gulayev, and now I'll show you another one. Okay, so this was Karolkov in the Lelo composition tournament in 1951, and here it's white to move, and here we have a position that could very easily occur in a serious game, tournament game, a normal chess game, and well, white doesn't have any chance of losing, we can see. But for example, if black takes the f-pawn here, he's going to draw, of course. So, you know, white needs to play f7. If bishop b2, black simply takes on f6, and after bishop takes, then can play king g8 even. Knight and bishop don't beat a bishop, of course, and if knight e7, king f7, and black's bishop's under attack. So white needs to play f7. And now we see that black has no way immediately to stop the pawn. If he plays rook f6, now bishop to b2. And black can't stop the pawn here. Rook is pinned. So after f7, meanwhile, of course, bishop takes f5, f8, queen wins. So black needs to give a check. It's the only move. And now white has a little bit of a problem, because if king b1, bishop takes f5 is check, and then it's black wins, actually. So king b2, on the other hand, black plays rook f6, and now bishop to b2 is not available. So black takes the f-pawn and draws, at least. So there's only one other move, bishop a3, threatening to queen the pawn, so black has to take it. If rook f6, again we play bishop b2 and white wins. So he has to take the bishop, and now king b2. And seems like black has a very serious problem. He can't stop the pawn from queening. The king can't get to g7. So he has a nice answer though here. He has the move rook to a2. Of course, if rook to b3, then king a2 and black runs out of checks. But rook a2, white can't take the rook because then bishop e6 followed by bishop takes f7 draws. So where's the white king going to go? King b1, black takes the knight with check, and then king g7. And if king c3, Then black plays rook c2, and white has still a problem. If king b3, bishop e6, wins the pawn and draws. King takes c2, black takes on f5 with check. So white needs to continue moving forward with, say, king d4, and now black gives a check on d2. If white goes king d4, black gives a check on d2, and after the king moves anywhere, black plays rook d8, and now it's clear the pawn isn't going anywhere. Black's going to draw, at least. So the other try is king b4, but black continues checking, rook b2. And if king a3, rook a2, and we're back where we were before. If king c5, continue checking. And if king d6, rook d2, king e7, rook d7, followed by taking the pawn, draws. So after rook a2, white has only one move, king c1. And now black has to continue finding checks, but rook c2 won't do because then white plays king d1. And there's no more checks, only on the dark squares, and then white simply takes the rook. So he has to check on a1. And now white king has to go up. King b2, rook a2, of course, would be a repetition. So king d2, rook a2, king e3. Black needs to check some more. Rook a3, king f4, and now rook a4. And if king e5, then I guess rook a5 here. So king g5, and now black only has one move, rook g4, because white's threatening to queen the pawn. So rook g4. But if white takes it now, black takes on f5. And after king takes f5, king g7, king e6, king f8, and now king f6 is draw. So after rook g4, white can't take the rook. He needs to play king h6. This is very nice. Of course, if king f6, then black can play rook to g8 here. But we'll see the point why king h6 is better. Now, black needs to play rook g8. If he plays rook g6, he loses. King takes g6, bishop takes f5, and now instead of taking the bishop, white plays king f6. And black can't stop the pawn. This is a nice little point. So rook to g8. And now it seems like it's a draw. The rook has taken control of the queening square. If white takes it, black obviously draws. And it seems like after rook f8, rook takes f7, black draws. But now knight e7, threatening to simply take the rook with checkmate. If rook f8, then knight g6 is checkmate. So black has only one move, bishop e6. If the rook moves, of course, off of the off of the 8th rank, white queens the pawn and wins immediately. So bishop e6, but now the final point. White queens the pawn, or can make it a rook, but queening is more natural. Bishop takes g8, and now knight g6. I think this is very beautiful, completely forced, ending in this very nice final position. It's really nice composition. So this is one of my favorites. Now, but I actually have saved the best one for last, but we'll get to that in a minute. First I'll show you another one here, one more and then the last one. So this composition is by Kralin and Kuznetsov. It's white to move here again. Black is about to queen the pawn on h1, and white needs to stop that from happening. So, yeah, for example, if white queens his pawn, black queens with check. King g3 is the only move, and now queen h2, king f3, queen f2 is mate. So that won't do. So white needs to stop black's pawn from queening, so bishop f3. Now, black queens his pawn. Otherwise, white simply queens his pawn. So black queens. And now white needs to queen his pawn. He needs to stop black from just taking on a7, so he queens. It's protected because of the discovered attack. If queen takes queen, then rook to e1. Only one move, king f2. Bishop takes queen, king takes e1, and now king g3, and white wins. Won't be a problem. White will simply take on h2, the king will come up to f4, and for example, it's king e2, king takes h2, king e3, king g3, and now black can't keep control of f4. King comes to f4 and pushes black's king away, and white takes g6, so it's a clear win. So black can't take white's queen. What is black going to do? He comes up with a very nice idea. He queens his own pawn with check. And the point is that black has a little stalemate defense here. After white takes the queen, which he has to do, now black takes white's queen. Now it seems like rook e1. Now black needs to play king. If king f2, of course, white wins just like before, but he has king h2. So if now white takes the queen, that's stalemate. But white has a beautiful move. Bishop e4. So now rook h1 is the threat. It seems like it's over. Rook h1, it's not stoppable. Black takes the bishop, white simply takes and wins, of course. Black has no checks, but he has a nice move. Queen a1. Again, if white takes the queen, it's stalemate. But white has an equally nice answer. Rook b1. The only move that doesn't allow black's queen to move anymore. It's now zugzwang. If black could sit here and wait, white wouldn't win. But unfortunately, black has to either take the rook, after which white wins easily, or move his queen away, allowing checkmate on h1. So, nice final position here. And now, this is my favorite, and I think that it's one of the better compositions of all time. I haven't seen them all. Okay, so this composition was by Genrikh Kasparian from 1935. And again, we have position, well, it's not that normal looking position, but it's normal enough. And we see white is down 2 exchanges, and black is about to take apart his pawn chain and win. But white has one main advantage in this position, that's black's kind of cramped king here on h5. Clearly we have to use that factor quickly. So white starts off with a nice attacking move, knight e8. Knight is heading into g7. We're going to see some unique mating patterns in this game, and that's one of the advantages to solving these studies. You find unique ideas that you can find during the game sometimes too. But they're not the type that are the most obvious. They increase your arsenal of ideas to a certain extent. So knight e8, threatening knight g7, followed by bishop f5 mate. So for example, g takes h4, knight g7, one move, king g6 is only move, and bishop f5. So taking on h4 won't do, and taking on f4 is no different, the same thing. So now black can play f5 to try to make room for his king on f6, but now white simply takes on f5, and the threat is knight f6 mate or knight g7 mate, and it's unstoppable. So f5 doesn't work here. And unfortunately, rook takes f4 actually transposes to the solution of the study, so I'm not going to show it yet. It makes things a little reaches the same position slightly quicker. So black plays king g6 here, stopping the immediate threat. Now, if white plays knight g7, renewing the threat of bishop f5 mate, black can play f5 now. And the king escapes on f6, and he's okay. So white has to act more quickly. So he plays h5. And there's only one move here. If king takes h5, we've deflected the king back to where he was, and then white wins by knight g7 and bishop f5 mate. So he has to take with a rook. And now white blocks the other flight square. Of course, if white does something else, black's going to play f5. So white plays f5 himself, forcing black to take it. And now black king has no moves at all, so white plays g4, threatening black's rook on f5. Bishop takes f5 mate. Of course, at this point, white's down a lot of material, so he's going to have to checkmate black. Black plays rook to e5. He needs to move his rook, obviously, and it doesn't matter where he moves it to at this point. So he threatens white's knight, and if, for example, knight g7, threatening bishop f5 followed by mate, black can now play f5, and he can give back a lot of material, and he'll still win. So white has a final beautiful finish here, bishop f5 instead of anything else, re-blocking black's f-pawn, giving up a piece each time to block black's f-pawn. And now after rook takes f5, the only move, knight g7. And we have a really nice final position. It looks kind of like a diamond of some sort. And the threat is g takes h5 or g takes f5 mate. And this is a double threat that cannot be met. Black's 2 rooks and 3 pawns are being entirely tied up by white's knight and pawn. So I think this is a very unique idea. And I particularly like compositions. They show you this magical world that you may not always find in games. Sometimes you can, but not always. And this type of thing really increases your appreciation for chess, which also increases your ability too. A lot of people are recently focused only on immediate practical benefits, specifically opening repertoire books, things like that. But there's more to chess than just the opening. So I think that it's very, very beneficial to try and solve studies, or at least to look at them. One of the problems is some of these studies simply too hard to study to solve for a normal person. So it can help to have a coach or teacher pick them out for you. Anyway, this has been International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com. Goodbye.